Have you ever had one of those moments when an ordinary afternoon suddenly felt different? Nothing around you seemed to change, yet something deep inside quietly whispered that a chapter was turning. Maybe you tried to ignore it. Maybe you convinced yourself it was just your imagination. But what if it wasn't? What if this afternoon became the moment someone finally found the courage to face emotions they had been hiding for far too long? Stay with this message, because every thought builds toward an ending that may completely change the way you see this connection. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with fireworks. They arrive quietly. They hide inside ordinary hours. While everyone else continues with their routines, two hearts unknowingly begin moving toward a conversation that has been delayed again and again. Imagine someone sitting alone after a long afternoon. Their phone rests beside them. They pick it up. They put it back down. They replay conversations from weeks ago. They remember words they wish they had said differently. They remember silence that lasted longer than it should have. Suddenly, what seemed like another ordinary day becomes impossible to ignore. The truth is, people don't always run from love. Sometimes they run from misunderstanding. Sometimes they step back because they believe they're protecting both people from more disappointment. And sometimes they stay quiet because they don't know whether they will be welcomed if they finally decide to speak. This afternoon represented something important. Not because something magical happened. Not because fate forced anyone's hand. But because clarity often arrives after enough time has passed for emotions to settle. Someone realized they could no longer keep pretending everything was fine. Think about how often people hide behind busy schedules. They tell themselves tomorrow will be better. Next week will be easier. Next month they'll finally explain everything. Yet tomorrow becomes another tomorrow. Until one afternoon changes everything. That is the kind of moment we're talking about. Picture someone looking out a window while the afternoon sunlight slowly fades. They aren't distracted anymore. The excuses have disappeared. For the first time in a long while, they allow themselves to admit one simple truth. I should have explained. Those 4 words carry enormous weight. Because explanations matter. Not every misunderstanding is permanent. Not every distance means the story has ended. Sometimes people simply lose the courage to begin the difficult conversation. And courage often returns quietly. This afternoon may have been exactly that kind of turning point. Perhaps they remembered something small. A laugh. A promise. A message they never answered properly. A goodbye that never felt complete. Funny how the smallest memory can become the strongest reminder. Many people believe life changes through dramatic events. Yet real transformation usually begins with reflection. Someone finally asked themselves difficult questions. What if they misunderstood your intentions? What if silence created confusion? What if fear made everything appear colder than it truly was? Those questions don't disappear easily. Once they arrive, they demand honest answers. That is why today feels different. Because reflection often becomes the first step toward healing. And healing begins long before anyone speaks a single word. The interesting part isn't simply that someone wants to explain themselves. The interesting part is why. People rarely seek explanations unless something still matters deeply. If there were no feelings left, there would be nothing left to explain. Remember that. Not every conversation is an attempt to return. Sometimes it's an attempt to restore peace. Sometimes it's an attempt to finally replace assumptions with honesty. Sometimes it's simply someone deciding they no longer want unfinished chapters controlling their future. Take a moment and think about every misunderstanding you've ever experienced. How many could have been solved with one calm conversation? Probably more than you realize. Because silence often creates stories that were never true. Our minds become expert storytellers. We imagine rejection. We imagine anger. We imagine disappointment. Meanwhile, the other person may be imagining exactly the same things. Two people waiting. Two people hoping. Two people believing the other no longer cares. What a heartbreaking misunderstanding that can become. But this afternoon, something shifted. Someone finally realized that avoiding discomfort only creates more confusion. And that realization can become the beginning of something entirely different. Before we continue, if stories about understanding, growth, and meaningful relationships inspire you, remember to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps this community continue exploring conversations that encourage reflection and hope. Now let's continue. Imagine the internal conversation taking place. What if they're willing to listen? What if I've waited too long? What if I explain everything honestly? Fear asks questions. Hope asks questions too. The difference is that hope quietly believes answers are still possible. This afternoon may have been filled with those questions. Someone may have walked through familiar places while replaying old memories. Each memory carrying another reminder. Not of perfection, but of possibility. Relationships aren't strengthened because everything always goes perfectly. They're strengthened because people eventually become brave enough to speak honestly. Honesty doesn't erase mistakes. It simply stops mistakes from growing larger. Think about that carefully. Silence expands uncertainty. Truth reduces it. That is why explanations matter. Not because they rewrite history, but because they help people understand history more clearly. Perhaps today someone stopped blaming circumstances. Perhaps they stopped blaming timing. Perhaps they stopped blaming distance. Instead, they accepted responsibility for the conversation that never happened. That level of maturity changes everything. Because ownership opens doors that excuses never can. Notice how life often gives us opportunities to pause before moving forward. This afternoon may have been exactly such a pause. Not the ending. Not even the beginning. But the moment someone decided the next chapter deserves honesty instead of assumptions. That decision matters. More than most people realize. Imagine carrying unanswered questions for months. Every day wondering. Every night replaying conversations. Every memory becoming slightly different each time you revisit it. Eventually you become exhausted. Not because of reality. Because of uncertainty. And uncertainty becomes heavier the longer it remains unanswered. Today someone finally became tired of carrying that weight. Instead of running from the conversation, they began preparing for it. Preparation often starts internally. Before people explain themselves to others, they first explain themselves to themselves. That process isn't easy. It requires humility. It requires patience. Most importantly, it requires honesty. The afternoon became a mirror. Not reflecting appearance. Reflecting character. Reflecting choices. Reflecting opportunities missed. And opportunities still waiting. Imagine realizing that one conversation could replace months of guessing. Wouldn't you eventually want that conversation too? That's exactly why today's realization feels significant. Because clarity is always more peaceful than confusion. As the afternoon quietly faded into evening, someone understood something they hadn't fully accepted before. Avoiding difficult conversations never protects meaningful connections. It only delays understanding. And delayed understanding often creates unnecessary distance. Distance doesn't always mean people stopped caring. Sometimes it simply means they stopped communicating. There is an important difference. Communication builds bridges. Assumptions build walls. This afternoon someone finally noticed which one they had been building. That realization wasn't comfortable. But growth rarely begins inside comfort. Growth begins the moment someone says, "I need to tell the truth." Those words change lives. Not because they guarantee perfect outcomes, but because they guarantee authenticity. Authenticity allows people to respond to reality instead of misunderstanding. Imagine how many relationships would improve if people chose honest conversations sooner rather than later. Imagine how many sleepless nights would disappear. Imagine how many questions would finally receive answers. This afternoon became valuable because someone finally imagined that future. A future where explanation replaces uncertainty. Where courage replaces hesitation. Where understanding replaces confusion. And perhaps the greatest realization of all. Sometimes the hardest conversation becomes the most meaningful one because it allows both people to finally stop wondering what really happened. The story doesn't end with uncertainty. It continues with the possibility that honesty, patience, and genuine understanding can open a new chapter, one built not on assumptions, but on clear words, mutual respect, and the courage to finally explain what happened that unforgettable afternoon. There is something remarkable about the hours that follow a difficult realization. At first, everything feels quiet. Almost too quiet. The outside world continues exactly as it always has. Cars pass by. People laugh. Notifications appear on phones. Conversations happen everywhere. Yet inside one person's heart, an entirely different conversation has begun. That is where this story continues. Because this afternoon was not simply about remembering the past. It became the moment someone could no longer avoid asking one life-changing question. What really happened between us? Not the version created by assumptions. Not the version shaped by fear. The real version. Sometimes people convince themselves they already know the answer. They tell themselves they were ignored. They tell themselves the other person stopped caring. They tell themselves everything ended for a reason. But certainty built on silence is rarely reliable. This afternoon, someone realized they had been living inside unanswered questions instead of verified truth. That realization stopped them in their tracks. Imagine opening an old conversation. Reading every message again. Not to relive the past, but to understand it differently. Words that once seemed cold suddenly appear uncertain. Sentences that once felt distant now sound hesitant. Pauses begin making sense. Moments that looked like rejection suddenly resemble confusion. Perspective changes everything. And sometimes one fresh perspective can undo months of emotional exhaustion. For the first time, they stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead they asked, "What was the other person experiencing that I never understood?" That single question transformed everything. Because empathy often arrives after pride quietly leaves the room. The truth is, everyone carries invisible battles. People smile while worrying. They laugh while questioning themselves. They continue their routines while carrying conversations they wish they could start over. Very few people reveal those battles immediately. Most hide them. Some become quieter. Others become busier. Some convince themselves that enough time has passed and it's too late to explain. But deep inside, the unfinished conversation remains. This afternoon reminded someone that silence never truly finishes anything. It only postpones it. They walked through memories one by one. Not searching for someone to blame. Searching for understanding. They remembered moments where both of you laughed effortlessly. Moments when conversations flowed naturally. Moments when hope seemed simple. Then they remembered the misunderstanding. Not because it was the biggest event, but because it became the turning point. How many stories change because of one misunderstood moment? More than most people realize. One sentence interpreted differently. One delayed reply. One assumption accepted as fact. One opportunity missed because neither person wanted to appear vulnerable. It happens every day. This afternoon, someone finally admitted that vulnerability is not weakness. Avoiding honesty had become far more exhausting than telling the truth. That realization stayed with them. Hour after hour. Instead of distracting themselves, they allowed every uncomfortable thought to surface. It wasn't easy. Some memories brought regret. Others brought gratitude. Some brought questions with no immediate answers. Yet they continued reflecting because they understood something important. Growth requires honesty before it produces peace. Without honesty, nothing changes. As daylight slowly disappeared, another realization quietly arrived. Maybe the explanation wasn't only for you. Maybe it was also for themselves. Sometimes people need to speak the truth aloud because they've been carrying it silently for far too long. Words trapped inside eventually become emotional weight. The longer they're hidden, the heavier they become. Today that weight became impossible to ignore. Imagine standing at the edge of an important conversation. You don't know exactly how it will go. You don't know every response. You don't know whether everything can be repaired. But you know remaining silent is no longer the right choice. That kind of courage isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, intentional. It doesn't seek perfection. It simply seeks honesty. The afternoon became a turning point because someone finally accepted that explaining themselves isn't about controlling another person's reaction. It's about respecting the truth. Respect begins there. With transparency. With responsibility. With the willingness to say, "This is what I was feeling. This is what I misunderstood. This is why I disappeared. I should have explained sooner." Imagine hearing those words after carrying unanswered questions for so long. Notice something. Those statements don't erase the past. But they replace guessing with clarity. And clarity has extraordinary power. Confusion drains people. Understanding restores them. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed. People sometimes spend months rehearsing conversations they never actually have. Every possible response. Every possible outcome. Every possible misunderstanding. Their imagination becomes louder than reality. That is exactly what happened here. Until this afternoon. Because eventually imagination becomes exhausting. Reality, even when difficult, becomes easier than endless uncertainty. Someone finally chose reality. They began writing thoughts down. Deleting them. Writing them again. Changing words. Searching for the clearest way to express emotions without creating more confusion. Every sentence mattered. Not because it had to sound perfect. Because it had to sound genuine. Authenticity cannot be manufactured. People recognize sincerity. Especially after long periods of silence. As evening approached, another realization quietly settled in. The explanation wasn't about proving innocence. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about allowing two people to understand the same story through honest conversation instead of separate assumptions. That difference matters more than people often realize. Assumptions create distance. Conversations create possibility. One closes doors. The other opens them. Imagine if every misunderstanding came with an opportunity to simply ask, "What did you mean?" Instead of immediately deciding, "I already know." How different would life become? Perhaps far more peaceful. This afternoon reminded someone that asking questions is often wiser than making conclusions. Humility arrived. And humility changed the direction of every thought that followed. The defensive walls slowly disappeared. Instead of preparing arguments, they prepared honesty. Instead of collecting reasons, they collected truth. Instead of expecting the worst, they became willing to accept whatever honest conversation might bring. That willingness represents genuine emotional growth. Not because it guarantees a particular ending, but because it guarantees integrity. As the evening grew quieter, they realized one final thing. Some explanations arrive late. But late honesty is still more valuable than permanent silence. Tomorrow may bring a conversation. Or perhaps it may simply bring peace within. Either way, this afternoon accomplished something extraordinary. It transformed hesitation into courage, confusion into reflection, and reflection into the quiet determination to finally explain everything that had remained unspoken for far too long. The story, however, is far from over. Because once someone decides to tell the whole truth, the next chapter is no longer about what happened. It becomes about what both hearts choose to do after the truth is finally heard. The most surprising part of this story isn't that someone finally found the courage to explain themselves. The surprising part is what happened after they stopped running from the truth. Because once the noise of fear became quiet, they noticed something they had completely overlooked. For weeks, maybe even months, they had been replaying the same painful memories. They believed every unanswered question pointed toward disappointment. They assumed every moment of silence meant the connection had faded. But this evening, after reflecting on everything that happened this afternoon, they realized something unexpected. The silence wasn't filled with certainty. It was filled with assumptions. And assumptions have a way of sounding convincing until they're challenged by honesty. That realization changed everything. Instead of asking, "What if it's too late?" a different question appeared. What if understanding has been waiting on one honest conversation all along? Think about that for a moment. How many opportunities disappear not because people stop caring but because neither person knows how to begin again? Sometimes the hardest part isn't saying the first word. It's believing the first word is still worth saying. This afternoon planted that belief. And by evening, it had grown stronger. Imagine someone sitting quietly, looking back over every turning point. Not searching for mistakes anymore. Searching for lessons. Every misunderstanding suddenly became a reminder that communication is precious. Every period of silence became proof that emotions left unspoken rarely disappear. They simply wait. Waiting for courage. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for the right moment. That is why this afternoon became unforgettable. Not because everything was instantly resolved, but because someone finally stopped pretending they didn't care. There is incredible strength in admitting that something still matters. Many people spend years convincing themselves they have moved on, when in reality they have only become skilled at avoiding certain memories. Avoidance isn't peace. It's postponement. Real peace comes from facing reality with honesty. And that's exactly what happened. One memory after another returned not to create regret but to reveal perspective. The conversations that once seemed incomplete suddenly carried new meaning. The pauses no longer looked empty. They looked human. Because every person has moments when fear speaks louder than confidence. Every person has days when they wish they had chosen different words. No one communicates perfectly. What matters is the willingness to grow afterward. That willingness became impossible to ignore. As the evening continued, they imagined what they would say if given the chance. Not dramatic speeches. Not perfect sentences. Just honest words. I've spent a long time thinking about what happened. I realize there were things I should have explained. I don't expect the past to change. But I don't want misunderstanding to have the final word. Simple. Sincere. Respectful. Sometimes those are the most powerful conversations anyone can have. Because honesty doesn't need decoration. It only needs courage. Now imagine hearing those words. Not as a promise. Not as certainty. But as genuine accountability. Wouldn't that feel different from endless guessing? Wouldn't clarity bring more peace than unanswered questions? That's the hidden lesson inside today's story. The explanation was never about changing yesterday. It was about refusing to let yesterday permanently define tomorrow. There comes a moment when every meaningful connection reaches a crossroads. One path is built on assumptions. The other is built on understanding. This afternoon became the moment someone chose understanding. Not because it was easier. Because it was wiser. As night settled in, they realized one final truth. Life rarely rewards perfect timing. It rewards sincere effort. Waiting forever rarely creates better conversations. It usually creates more distance. That is why today mattered. Today became the day they stopped waiting for the perfect moment. Instead, they became ready for an honest one. And honest moments often become the beginning of remarkable new chapters. Before you leave, take a quiet moment to reflect on your own life. Has there ever been a conversation you wished had happened differently? Has there ever been something you hoped another person understood without you ever saying it? Sometimes the answers we're searching for begin with the courage to communicate openly, listen carefully, and allow room for understanding. Perhaps that is the real message hidden inside this afternoon. Not that every story ends the way we expect. But that every meaningful story deserves honesty before conclusions. If this message encouraged you to reflect, let it stay with you beyond this video. Carry forward the reminder that understanding grows where communication begins, that patience often reveals what assumptions hide, and that the strongest connections are strengthened not by perfection, but by sincerity, respect, and the willingness to explain what truly happened. Thank you for spending these moments here. Take care of your heart, value honest conversations, and remember this. Sometimes the most important explanation isn't the one that changes the past. It's the one that gives the future a fair chance.